All right. Welcome, everyone. Okay. Welcome, everyone, to this panel on the public health and humanitarian situation in Gaza. Our conversation today marks a somber milestone of nearly 1 month since the start of this latest war between Israel and Hamas. My name is Monette Zard, and I'm the director of the program on forced migration and health at the Mailman School of Public Health at Columbia University. As a program focused on the health, rights, and well-being of people caught up in conflict and people on the move, the starting point for our work is that all civilians in conflict should be protected. And unfortunately, that has been far from the case in what we have seen unfolding live on our screens and on social media over the last month. The horrific attacks on civilians undertaken by Hamas on October the 7th killed over 1,400 men, women, and children, and the fate of more than 200 people kidnapped and currently held in Gaza remains unknown. The resulting military response by Israel in Gaza has also had an outsized impact on civilians. As of this morning, we've likely passed 10,000 Palestinian civilians killed, nearly 40% of them children, with attacks on schools, ambulances, UN shelters, and refugee camps that many senior UN officials have suggested could constitute war crimes. At least 1.4 million Palestinians have been displaced. Although very limited aid is now being allowed into Gaza, it is vastly below what is required to sustain life for the population there, and the restrictions on food, fuel, water, and other vital supplies suggest strongly that these most basic items are being weaponized by Israel in this conflict. Hospitals and healthcare workers have been caught up in the center of hostilities. Doctors have been vocal in drawing attention to the untenable conditions in which they are having to work, operating on people without anesthetic, without power, with clean water in short supply, and with many basic supplies depleted. Hospitals and ambulances have also increasingly come under direct fire, with accusations and counter-accusations that these facilities are being used to shield the activities of armed groups. We have seen rhetoric on all sides that dehumanizes and instrumentalizes civilian life. Now, history and context is critical here, and it is contested, as it is in every other humanitarian and conflict setting. At a minimum, we should understand that over 2/3 of the population of Gaza are families that have fled or were forced from their homes during the war surrounding Israel's creation in 1948. And it is also important to note that the civilian population in Gaza has endured a stifling economic blockade by land, sea, and air since 2007, shortly after Hamas came to power, with severe restrictions on the movement of goods and people. And this blockade has dramatically degraded the living conditions, health system, and infrastructure for Gazans, even before this latest round of conflict. For example, 62% of Gazans already required food assistance to meet their basic needs, even before this current crisis. So this is the backdrop against which this tiny enclave of 2 million people is currently enduring its 5th war in 15 years. Now, our panel today represents a mix of expertise from across the medical, public health, and humanitarian fields, as well as experts in law and policy analysis, to help us understand the full import of the humanitarian and public health crisis that is unfolding in Gaza, and what it portends for the wider region and for the future. We were hoping to have 6 speakers with us today, but unfortunately, Dr. Barghouti has had to pull out this morning due to an unexpected emergency with their medical teams in Gaza, and he sends his apologies. So we now have 5 distinguished speakers with us. Our first speaker will be Ellen Watsa-Stryker, who is the US humanitarian representative with Médecins Sans Frontières. Ella joined MSF in 2014 as part of the response to the West African Ebola outbreak and has responded to humanitarian emergencies in the Democratic Republic of Congo, South Sudan, Myanmar, Tanzania, Kenya, and Greece. And for the students in the audience, worth noting that Ella has a Master's of International Affairs from Columbia University School of International and Public Affairs with a focus on global humanitarian health. Our second speaker is Dr. Aisha Kadir, Senior Humanitarian Health Advisor with Save the Children International. Dr. Kadir is a pediatrician and works in clinical care, public health research, and health and policy advocacy. Dr. Kadir worked with international NGOs, universities, governments, and the World Health Organization before starting her current role with Save the Children. Our third speaker will be Dr. Emanuela Chiara Gillard, Senior Visiting Fellow at the Oxford Institute for Ethics, Law, and Armed Conflict at the University of Oxford, and an Associate Fellow in Chatham House's International Law Program. From 2007 to 2012, she was Chief of the Protection of Civilians section in the Policy Development and Studies branch of the United Nations Office for the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs, UN-OCHA. And for 7 years before joining UN-OCHA, Dr. Gillard was a legal advisor at the International Committee of the Red Cross. Our fourth speaker is Meirav Sunshine, Senior Analyst on Israel-Palestine for the International Crisis Group. Meirav is an Israeli-American journalist and commentator who has covered Israeli politics and US foreign policy for over a decade. Her work has appeared in the New York Times, the Washington Post, the New York Review of Books, Foreign Policy, and The Guardian, just to name a few. And she is a founding editor of Plus 972 magazine and a contributor to Jewish Currents. Our final speaker is Dr. Selma Dabbagh, Head of Strategy and Partnerships at the International Center of Justice for Palestinians. Dr. Dabbagh is a British Palestinian lawyer and writer and has worked for numerous human rights NGOs in Palestine, Egypt, and London. She is a qualified solicitor and is also an accomplished novelist, and her writing has won awards and has been published by Bloomsbury, the London Review of Books, Granta, GQ magazine, and her plays have been produced by the BBC. Now, the panelists and I will have a conversation over the next hour or so, and then we should have time to take questions from the audience, which you can be writing into the Q&A box. So, moving first to Ella from MSF. Ella, welcome. Now, Ella, MSF has had operations in Gaza for a number of years now, and it would be great, I think, for our audience if you could summarize what MSF's work in Gaza has been, and also what are some of the key challenges that you are currently facing in your operations, the primary healthcare needs that you're confronting, and also perhaps some of the longer term needs that you see that will come about because of the destruction of the healthcare system.
Sure, thanks. Thanks so much for inviting me and for organizing this panel. Indeed, MSF first worked in Palestine in 1989, and we've worked steadily in Gaza for the past 20 years. In 2022, we had 367 staff working for us between the West Bank and Gaza. And I think in order to understand the current humanitarian health crisis, we really have to understand the history of forced displacement, military control, and blockade. And under the blockade, everything going into Gaza and going out of Gaza was controlled by Israel. And these restrictions also applied to humanitarian staff and humanitarian aid. So working in Gaza has long been a challenge for MSF. Like other humanitarian organizations, we really face a lot of complicated and opaque bureaucratic systems for both getting our humanitarian staff as well as medical supplies into Gaza. Some medications and therapies have not been permitted at all. For example, cancer therapies that are for patients who have more advanced cancer diagnosis have been completely prohibited. So someone who had that more advanced diagnosis would have to apply for permission to leave Gaza, go into Israel each time that they needed treatment. Sometimes they were denied a pass, sometimes the permission was delayed and they missed treatments. So it's been very complicated for a long time. We've also struggled, We've also struggled with pediatric referrals. So often children would receive permission to go into Israel for advanced care, but their parents didn't. And so then we were forced this sort of cruel separation between an ill or injured child and their family. We've been blocked from bringing MRI machines in. Artificial limbs have often been blocked. We've not been able to import 3D printers to make custom artificial limbs for patients on the spot. Even something like a washing machine could be delayed for up to a year. So it's a very, very complicated process. And all of these have really negatively affected the larger health system since 2007. The work MSF has been doing in Gaza has been primarily focused on specialized care, supporting hospitals as well as outpatient clinics. And that includes surgery, physiotherapy, occupational health, psychological support, and so on. Today, our ability to coordinate medical assistance is completely blocked. Between the intensity and indiscriminate bombings and the siege, our ability to rotate specialized staff in is non-existent. We are still trying. We also can't get supplies to our staff who continue to work in Palestine. It's very difficult to communicate with them. It's very difficult to get information back from them. We just don't have the very basic ability to give them the medications and supplies that they need to treat patients. We don't have the ability to supply hospitals with food or water or electricity. And this is really shaping up to be a form of collective punishment against the civilian population. At last count, 14 out of 35 hospitals with inpatient services were shut down. Medical workers have had no choice but to ration care, which is very, very difficult, particularly for those working for MSF and organizations who care deeply about medical ethics. They've had to perform surgeries on patients without anesthesia. They're treating children with huge burns across their bodies without the pain meds that they need. It's physically exhausting, it's mentally exhausting. The health staff are really, really struggling to keep going. And at this point, our objective is to bring emergency medical teams back into Gaza to assess the needs in the operating space and begin supporting Palestinian colleagues in this really nearly impossible task to bring medical care to people of Gaza. I think the obvious priority is for trauma surgical care, but we know that all needs are going to be very, very high on the medical front. Women continue to deliver babies regardless of conflict. Children still need routine pediatric care. So at this point, everything is needed, and we have virtually nothing to work with.
It's a very sobering picture. Now, you know, as we have been seeing in the news, healthcare workers, humanitarian workers have been killed. Hospitals have been directly hit and are increasingly being encircled during this conflict. And the IDF has also issued a number of evacuation orders for hospitals in northern Gaza. Can you talk a little bit more about what it means to evacuate a hospital under these circumstances and the efficacy of such warnings in terms of meeting the obligations on parties to the conflict not to target medical facilities?
I mean, the simple answer is evacuating hospitals under these circumstances is not possible. Some patients might be able to leave, but others are in extremely critical condition. They're not able to move independently. They're not able to breathe without assistance. They require constant medical care. And as the bombing continues and as hospitals and ambulances have been struck, we have no way of moving these patients and we have nowhere to move them to. So the few functioning hospitals are already over capacity and in rupture of essential supplies. So it's not as though you can put someone safely in an ambulance and have any guarantee that ambulance won't be hit. And you have no guarantee that you can take them to a hospital where they will receive treatment. Additionally, due to the indiscriminate attacks on the civilian infrastructure, many homes have been destroyed, and this is leaving population with really few choices in where to shelter in Gaza. Remember, people can't leave Gaza, they're trapped. So many families are sheltering on hospital grounds, and they're hoping that maybe the hospital is safer. Although we know that hospitals like schools and places of worship are also being hit. we are really insisting that international humanitarian law prohibits the direct and disproportionate attack on hospitals and civilians, and parties to the conflict are bound to refrain from attacking medical facilities. And in fact, they must proactively protect medical facilities from hostilities. When a military power gives an order of evacuation, they are actually responsible to ensure that evacuations happen under conditions of safety, and that's not what's happening right now. And then also, despite an evacuation order, civilians who did not evacuate are still protected. Hospitals are still protected, even if an evacuation order is given.
Thank you for clarifying that. Now, a key concern of the IDF, at least as stated by the IDF and the government, in further opening up access to aid, is that aid will be repurposed for military use by Hamas and other armed groups. Now, you've worked in multiple conflict settings, as has MSF over decades. Can you speak to that concern, and in specifically what kinds of strategies humanitarians have in place to mitigate that concern?
Sure. I mean, the beginning of the answer is that our work is guided by humanitarian principles, and we rely on these principles to gain access and protection in conflict settings. One of these principles is independence, which means that MSF offers assistance to a country or a population on the basis of our own assessment of their need. And we ask for the ability to freely access populations and control the aid that we provide. So we're a direct care provider. Whether we're working in Ukraine or South Sudan or Palestine, our ability to provide that direct medical care and to determine the conditions of our work is really essential to ensuring that medical care reaches those it's intended for. Which again is guided by the principle of impartiality, which states that medical care in conflict is provided on the basis of need. We routinely face obstacles from governments and armed groups who might prefer to control the flow of humanitarian aid themselves. And we've really learned over time how to navigate these problems through negotiation, through diplomacy, sometimes by suspending services until we have assurances that our aid will not be interfered with. When we think about impartial medical humanitarian assistance, it's really only intended for and delivered to civilians and the injured or ill. So, and again, on the basis of need. So under IHL, civilians and the wounded and sick are by definition entitled to receive medical care, and humanitarian aid workers are protected in the delivery of impartial aid. We often have this excuse of dual use goods but the reality is you can't use that excuse to deny medical aid to civilian populations. In Gaza, we're not aware of reports of large-scale or systematic diversion of humanitarian supplies. This isn't our experience working there. And the civilian population of 2.3 million people, again, nearly half of whom are children, cannot be collectively punished by depriving them to life-saving medical care.
Great. Thank you, Anna. I'm sure we will circle back to you also to tease out a little bit more how the humanitarian principles are operating in this space. But thank you so much for laying out that groundwork in terms of what the current situation is. I think we're going to build on that now with our second speaker, Dr. Kadir. Dr. Kadir, as the Senior Humanitarian Health Advisor for Save the Children, could you tell us a little bit more about how the current conflict is specifically impacting children in Gaza and in Israel? And how does this compare to other conflicts in which you have worked in?
Yeah, in order to do this, I'm just going to quickly share a slide because I'd like to kind of illustrate to the audience what to set the framework for what I'll talk about. Basically, I'd just like you to think about children in different ages and stages of development. Sorry, this seems to have gone backwards. So you can see children, a newborn. Just take a moment to think about the difference between a newborn and a toddler and a 6-year-old and a 15-year-old. They're very, very different. And so the health risks and needs for children who are affected by conflict are very much affected or determined, in fact, by their age and stage of development. So conflict has, we think about the impacts as being direct and indirect. And so direct impacts are things like, well, being killed or injured, as we're hearing with the latest statistics. There's extraordinary loss of life in this conflict for children and injuries. The most recent figures are 9,770 people in Gaza have been killed. 4,008 of them are children. And in Israel, there were 1,400 who were killed, 31 of them who are children. And then there are also 30 hostages that are still being held in Gaza, and in the West Bank, 144 people have been killed since the 7th of October, and 43 of them have been children. These are really extraordinary numbers. And so that's just sort of the most extreme, being killed. Injured, the number of injured is also extreme. And this happens due to explosions, gunshot wounds, and collapsing buildings, or if there are mines, and mines where kids are running around or moving around, they can step on them or pick them up, and they can explode. And so the profile of injuries that they get from this is different to adults. Other direct impacts are psychological trauma from being injured, from witnessing other people, including their parents and their families, injured and killed, seeing dead bodies and heavy shelling at night, seeing adults who are in distress or in despair. So this sense of safety that's completely shattered. And there are also illnesses that can occur directly from combat activities. So Human Rights Watch has documented white phosphorus use and chemical weapons. Children are they're thought to be more susceptible to chemical weapons. They have a different physiology to adults. They breathe faster, their heart rates are faster, the body surface area is different. And so when children are exposed to chemical weapons, they tend to be more ill and have higher mortality rates. And studies do show that in other conflicts where chemical weapons have been used, they have higher mortality rates. So and there are also indirect impacts, and these are long-lasting, and they're mediated by complex political, social, economic, and environmental changes. And so there are a range of factors: inadequate and unsafe living conditions, environmental hazards from collapsed buildings and sharp objects and explosive ordnance, unexploded ordnance around, and other harmful or dangerous hazards. Also, when things like buildings collapse and a refrigerator leaks, then there can be chemicals in the environment as well. So these are hazards for children's health. Caregiver mental health is extremely important, and that is stressed under these kinds of situations. Separation from family can be common, also being orphaned. Displacement, and we've seen 1.5 million people displaced from the north of Gaza. And then, of course, as my colleague from MSF has so carefully described, the destruction of health and public health infrastructure, as well as education and economic infrastructure. So, for example, infectious diseases in conflict settings are common because of both a breakdown in public health infrastructure, as well as overcrowding in living conditions and inadequate water and sanitation. And there are now some reports of chickenpox and other infections, and there's a very high risk in this context of diarrhea outbreaks, respiratory infections, measles, cholera. In Gaza, because of the 16-year siege, there were already high rates of malnutrition in children, and also high rates of psychological distress and mental ill health. And because of food insecurity and hampered living conditions. And so this, we expect now, will be significantly worse, as we know that there's been very, very severe shortages of water and food from the complete siege, and now very limited aid has been able to enter over the last week or so, not nearly enough to be able to meet the need. So I think probably the difference between this conflict and other conflict areas where I've worked in is the scale and the severity of the impacts on children. And this is probably most clearly evidenced by the extraordinary proportion of deaths. Up to 40% of fatalities are children, and this doesn't include all the children who are still missing and trapped under the rubble. And the access restrictions that my colleague described and the siege on fuel means that very limited aid is able to get into the north. And so this very seriously undermines our impartiality, our ability to be impartial and independent to provide care where there's a need.
I mean, you've described, the effects of the siege and the high levels, existing levels of malnutrition. I'm conscious that, for a 15-year-old in Gaza, this is their 5th war. And I wonder if you could speak a little bit more about these, the impacts of the current and these previous cycles of violence on both the physical and mental health of Palestinian children and adolescents, and how you think about that in your work.
Yeah. So we can already pick out a number of very serious harms. I just listed a few. My colleague also listed a number, but it only scratches the surface of how this conflict and past conflicts will have been affecting the children there. So I think at least one point I'd really like to make is that severe adversity, it's known to have pervasive, harmful effects on children's growth, like the physical growth of their body, the development of all of their organ systems, and also the development of their nervous systems, the structure, architecture of the brain even can be affected. And this is particularly when there's multiple forms of severe adversity. That's when we really see this. And that's called toxic stress. You may have heard that term. Children in Gaza, with what they're experiencing now, we can expect that they're already experiencing multiple forms of toxic stress. So it will be altering the way that their bodies and all their organ systems develop. And there are very well-known profiles for physical health and development, sort of physical ill health or illness, and developmental delays, and also mental health problems, which follow them throughout their lives. And is related to early death as well. And I think an important thing to think about is the usual protective capacities, so relative safety breaks in the bombardment, and the presence of and support, effective support from the family have been stripped away. Parents have been stripped, families have been stripped of their ability to be able to provide their children with safety and a sense of security. So when we want to respond to toxic stress, particularly, or adversity, it's social. The insults or the harms are social in origin, and so the response to it should also be social. Of course, you need to respond to the physical health needs and the mental health needs, but the really fundamental way to respond is actually through providing safety and basic needs, and then the care that they need. And this has been very, very difficult, but it's up to us. If there's political will to stop, for a ceasefire and to allow humanitarian access, then a lot of these harms can be mitigated. So it's happening right now. It's harming children right now, but the way they adapt and respond to it is still, there is still a possibility to mitigate a lot of this if we were just allowed to. Another thing I think is really important to think about is disability. We know that there are extraordinary numbers of children who have been killed and injured, but the profile of the injuries, like what we call the epidemiology of the injury profile, is very, very closely related to the way a conflict is waged. So explosions, shelling, collapsing buildings, shooting, these kinds of injuries often cause, for example, as MSF also has described, amputations and many other kinds of injuries that will be very serious for children, severe burns. And for those who survive, they are likely to have disability, which will affect their functioning and really the whole trajectory of their lives and the kinds of opportunities they have in the future. We also know that a fraction of the hospitals in Gaza are functioning. They have extremely low supplies. We heard about operations without anesthesia and treatment of severe burns in children without pain control. So we can expect children have both severe psychological distress from this, but also physical disabilities. And in terms of the psychological aspect, I really want to emphasize that not all children who experience trauma become traumatized. So this is, again, where what we do and the way we respond to help children becomes extremely important. If the violence stops, and if we're able to provide children with access to their basic needs and relevant support, reunite the children who are separated from their families, including the hostages, but also all the other unaccompanied and separated children, and provide relevant and appropriate psychosocial and mental health services for those who need it, there's actually a good chance they can adapt positively. But without that, we are pretty much guaranteeing severe distress.
So, Dr. Kadir, I had a last question for you, which was, what is Save the Children's priority now in terms of interventions? But I think you just outlined that. I heard ceasefire, and those other measures that you just outlined. Is there anything else you wanted to add? Yeah,
so Save the Children is providing, we work across a range of sectors to respond to children's needs. So not just the health and nutrition and also water, sanitation, hygiene, but we also work in education and protection. And so we talked about the social determinants now. We also do some work in cash and food security and livelihoods as well. The work from these different sectors, we try to target different aspects of a child's life. So we have a more holistic, keep the child in view, the child and their family, their community, and put these structures in place to support. So in Gaza right now, it means focusing on children's basic needs and advocacy to make as many people as possible aware of what this conflict is doing to children and to stop the violence and allow unrestricted humanitarian access. There has been, so Save the Children has been able to, because of the limitations in access, we've managed to bring just 3 trucks of supplies in. One of those is a truckload of water. It was 45,000 bottles of water. And I think this is an important point to make. It's about 27,000 liters, and it went into Gaza on the 29th of October. And the supplies were delivered to the Khan Yunis shelter, where 43,000 people were sheltering at the time. And so that one truck provided less than 1.6 liters of water per person in the shelter for the day. And the WHO recommended minimum for water needs for people in emergencies is 15 liters per person per day for drinking, cooking, and cleaning. And so there's just very, very limited access to the basic needs. Once we do have access, our work will focus on, and our work at the moment also still, safety and security of our staff and volunteers, of course, but then using this integrated intersectoral approach. So providing the basic needs, supplies, that's food, water, and medical supplies, and then mental health and psychosocial support for children, and families, responding to gender-based violence, sexual and gender-based violence. And then SAVE will be leading the global child protection area of responsibility coordination, and the working group on unaccompanied and separated children, trying to get children back together with their families. So I think the point of this is that when we think about child health, we need to think about other sectors as well, because they have really huge and measurable impacts on children's health. Great.
Thank you so much. Thank you for your clarity and your passion for this work. Dr. Gillard, you have been hearing, colleagues outline the humanitarian conditions in Gaza. I often, when we are teaching our humanitarian law segment, begin with warning our students that the levels of death and destruction that are permissible under humanitarian law are astounding and shocking to anyone who's used to working within a human rights frame. But there are limits. There are some limits, and I think it would be great if you could begin by reminding us what some of the key elements are in international humanitarian law that should guide the conduct of hostilities by both Israel and Hamas and other armed groups?
Thank you so much, Monette, and thank you very much also for those opening words, because whenever I start speaking about the rules of IHL, I give the same warning. We're not talking human rights, we are talking the law applicable in armed conflict, and it tolerates a lot of injury, death, and destruction. In the words of Harold Koh, the former State Department legal advisor, there is lots that's lawful, but it's awful. And I feel I always have to premise what I say when describing IHL with that. I'm actually going to take a step back and highlight some of the key principles of IHL, international humanitarian law, because it helps us understand how this body of law operates. The first point we've got to understand is that it applies independently of the lawfulness of resort to armed force in the first place. These are two totally distinct bodies of law. They do not influence each other in any shape or form, which means that international humanitarian law applies equally to all sides to a conflict, regardless of whether the use of force was permissible under the rules regulating use of force, which we find in the UN Charter. The second point, and thank you for already flagging this, it's important to bear in mind that both sides have obligations. Israel has obligations, and Hamas and the other groups fighting in Gaza today have same obligations. They must refrain from attacking civilians. They must refrain from indiscriminate attacks. They must comply with the rule of proportionality. And if you'll let me, I'll elaborate this a bit because it's frequently misunderstood. There are also broader obligations to spare civilians from the effects of hostilities more generally. Important obligations to take precautions in attack, but also in defense. Important obligations that tie in with the previous speakers to respect and protect the wounded and sick, medical establishments, ambulances, for example. Equally importantly, an obligation not to use civilians to shield military objectives or to otherwise impede military obligations. And I haven't even started discussing the rules regulating humanitarian relief operations. Perhaps we can come to that later. Again, something that the previous speakers flagged. With regard to all of these rules, violation by one side doesn't entitle the other to disregard its own obligations. There's no reciprocity in IHL. And then another preliminary point that I think is important to highlight is that determining whether a violation of IHL has occurred can be difficult during the heat of battle. There are some violations that are immediately apparent. Any torture is a violation. Any sexual violence is a violation. Hostage taking is a violation. Violations of the rules regulating the conduct of hostilities, the rules I mentioned just now, are far more difficult to establish from the outside. Why? Because although there's, for example, a very clear prohibition on attacking a civilian object, it could be that at a particular moment in time, that object has become a military objective because of the way it is used. So I always make this note of caution. Careful, it's very difficult in the heat of battle, like right now, to make a clear determination of whether certain things are a violation of IHL. You asked me to flag some of the principal rules. I'd say first and foremost, the principle of distinction. Parties must distinguish at all times between combatants, fighters, and civilians, military objectives and civilian objects, and only direct attacks against military objectives and combatants. There mustn't be indiscriminate attacks that are not aiming at particular military objectives, attacks that violate the rule of proportionality. And I would say it's also important to highlight the obligations to take precautions when carrying out attacks, to maximum extent feasible, spare civilians from the effects of hostilities, so a broader range of restraint than just not directly attacking them or indiscriminate attacks, and also importantly the obligations on the defender to take measures to spare civilians under its control, for example by not placing military objectives in densely populated areas, or by moving civilians from military objectives to the extent feasible.
So, I mean, as you indicated, Dr. Gillard, it's very difficult in the heat of battle to make some of these determinations. But I want to put one very concrete example to you, and I'd appreciate it if you could walk us through what are the factors one has to bear in mind. So, for example, the recent attack on the Jabalia refugee camp, very heavy weapons grade munitions dropped, hundreds injured, killed, in an effort to target one military commander. Could you walk us through what a proportionality analysis might look like in relation to that? Because certainly, the civilian deaths and injuries that resulted from that particular instance were very heavy indeed.
Absolutely. And just to clarify, what I said is it's difficult from the outside in the heat of battle to determine whether a violation of the rules regulating conduct of hostilities has occurred. But that's a very good example. So the first step is actually identifying the military objective. So in this particular case, it was identifying the military commander. Once this has been done, what needs to occur is that any attack against this particular military objective must comply with the rule of proportionality. And I would say this is one of the most misunderstood rules of IHL. There's frequently a tendency to assume proportionality requires you to compare the dead and injured civilians on one side with those on the other side. This isn't the case. The rule of proportionality in IHL, it's really quite specific. First and foremost, we're looking at the incidental harm, so the death or injury of civilians, damage to civilian property caused by one specific attack. It's really an assessment that needs to be carried out attack by attack. You're not looking at the entire military operation, you're looking at the specific attack. So in this particular instance, it would be the attack against that military commander. And what is required? It's before the decision to launch this attack, the party that's carrying out the attack must, on the one hand, determine the military advantage expected, anticipated from that particular attack, so the military advantage of killing that particular commander on the one hand, and on the other hand, they need to determine the expected incidental harm. And what is this? It's the expected death or injury of civilians or damage to civilian objects. So they need to accurately identify these. In this particular instance, I think what was it was important to determine both the expected number of civilians' death or injury, and also the nature of the damage to civilian objects. The context in which a particular attack is conducted is extremely important because it affects the weight to be given to the damage, for example, that occurs in a context such as Gaza today, with, as the other speakers have noted, very limited opportunities to find alternative accommodation. The weight to be given to the damage to civilian property is far more significant, for example, than in a context where there are alternatives for civilians to flee to relocate to. So this is the kind of information that must be acquired by the party considering the attack and balanced. Now, the challenge, as I say, looking at conduct of hostility from the outside is that we see one side of the equation. We see the death and injury of civilians, we see the damage to civilian objects. We have no visibility on the expected military advantage. We know it's a military commander, but we do not know more. And also, it is not the public that carries out this assessment to determine whether the incidental harm would be excessive compared to the military advantage. This is a balance that is carried out, that is struck by the military commander. I have to say that what's important to bear in mind is that this is the rule of proportionality. It's not the only rule that needs to be considered. There are obligations to take other precautions. So, for example, in making the decision to attack this particular refugee camp, other considerations should have been what weapons, for example, can be used to minimize this incidental harm. What about the timing? Would there have been opportunities to carry out the same attack against that particular person at a time when the harm to civilians could have been lower? There's a number of factors that need to also be taken into account to minimize the harm to civilians.
Interesting. I listened to an interesting reflection from Tom Dannenbaum from Tufts University recently, and he also posed it in this way, which I found sort of interesting, which is, you know, the benefit of that military gain, that individual military commander. Would you have reached the same conclusion if this was a dense civilian area, perhaps populated by, or in Tel Aviv, for example? Would you have used the same calculation in terms of civilian harm, irrespective of nationality? Because IHL is blind to nationality in terms of how it defines civilian, which I found very helpful. Great, thank you. I mean, I'm sure we're going to come back to discuss some more of this. Ooh, I just lost you here. You're back. Good, I didn't lose you permanently. I'm sure we will come back and we will discuss more of some of these issues, but I do want to move on in the interest of time to Meirav Zonshine. Meirav, thank you for joining us and, you know, helping us, I think, understand a little bit more about the political and geopolitical context in Israel at the moment and Palestine. And I think, you know, Israel, you know, suffered clearly a horrific attack on October 7th, and it continues to relive this attack because of the ongoing concern around the 200 plus civilians who were kidnapped and are being held in Gaza, and also the way in which these attacks are being filmed and broadcast. And it's been likened to Israel's 9/11 moment. And I think it would be helpful to try and understand a little bit more about the current political dynamics, both governmental and civil society, around this conflict in Israel. And so perhaps my first question to you is that, you know, Prime Minister Netanyahu has stated that the Israeli military aims to eliminate Hamas. And as the US has seen in its war with Al-Qaeda and Islamic State, this is much easier said than done. And I think with that in mind, it would be helpful to understand a little bit more about how you view what that interpretation of victory is, how the Israeli government is approaching that, and what kind of planning, if any, is there for the post-conflict period in Gaza and also the West Bank.
Thank you, Monette. Thank you for this very important panel. So, as you said, this really was an earth-shattering moment for Israelis, and it's hard to overstate just how vulnerable Israelis feel across the country. It's also important to note that entire communities in the south have now been displaced, as well as in the north, because of what's happening on the border with Lebanon. So as far as Israel is concerned, I mean, it wants to do a few things in its victory. Most clearly, it has set out as a goal to destroy Hamas and basically to enact regime change there, something that it's never tried to do in Gaza, and something that in historical experiences doesn't usually work very well. So it's set a very, very high goal, and it has also repeatedly said, the IDF, that this will take a very long time, that it's not something that can happen quickly. And so there's a lot of factors that constrain how I think this will develop. But as far as Israel's goals, it has to restore, first of all, security for all citizens, and specifically on the borders that are now under rocket threat and other types of threat, and also rehabilitation of communities that have been almost wiped out and houses damaged. And it also wants to return the hostages. In order to be able to destroy Hamas, as it says, it needs to hurt its military capabilities and its military infrastructure, and also it's targeting all of its major leaders, the military leaders and the political leaders. It's unclear whether it can actually do that. And I think it's clear to many of us in the policy world that a military operation, military force is not going to bring a solution to this issue, even if Israel is able to really incapacitate Hamas, which is a consensus across the Israeli spectrum. It's unclear what will come of Gaza, what will happen the day after. And what we're seeing thus far is a tactic of a lot of civilian destruction, something that we've seen in previous rounds in Gaza, something we've also seen Israel do in 2006 in Lebanon, which, the way Israel understands it, Hamas is embedded in civilian areas. It purposely embeds itself in those areas. And as far as Israel is concerned, it has asked and called on civilians to leave, to move south. Many of them have. Obviously, many of them can't or won't. And Israel knows that. And it has anyway decided to target Hamas officials and infrastructure relentlessly. And in doing so, I mean, it's impossible for Israel to conduct this war without destroying the lives of many people. But as far as it's concerned, it's doing what it needs to do, and it has warned that it's going to do so. So it's trying to take what it thinks are the best precautions. It's also important to note that in the years leading up to this attack and to this war, Israel's policies were pretty much to ignore Gaza, to contain Hamas as much as it can, to not really deal with the situation. There's been a blockade and a siege, which clearly has not been effective because of the mass tunnel network and the infrastructure that has been built up anyway. Israel and Egypt both blockade the Gaza Strip. And so the years leading up to this were one in which Israel really acted in general on the Palestinian issue with a lot of impunity, and it really felt like it was invincible. And instead of having any kind of punitive actions from international stakeholders or from the US, it was actually oftentimes rewarded with diplomatic moves like the Abraham Accords and other things, and military aid that doesn't stop. And so Israel really got to a point where Gaza was just not on its list of issues to deal with. And so because of the severity of this attack, it now feels all the more emboldened. And it also says to itself, well, Hamas, clearly doesn't care about its own civilians either. And it took this risk with this type of attack, and it does all these things that if they don't care about their civilians, then why should we? So I think that's it doesn't consider Hamas to be a rational actor either. At this point, it considers it, the comparisons that you mentioned to ISIS, I think clearly there's a lot of problems with that comparison for various reasons. Also, ISIS was something that came in from outside, and here Hamas is more natural, and it's more deep and rooted into Gaza Strip, so it's different. But that's a way that Israel is trying to get international legitimacy to continue with its operation. Now, as far as the post-war or end game or how things will look, I think that this is not something that Israel really knows yet, and I think nobody really knows yet what it's going to look like. In part because there's no very good options, and also because Israel is only concerned now with the immediate goals, but also because, like I said before, it simply hasn't really felt like it needs to deal with this issue. It thought it could put it under the rug, it could put it aside. And I think what's very, very clear is that and this is true across the spectrum for everybody in the region and the US, that, clearly you cannot ignore the Palestinian issue. That's not something that is feasible. It's not something that is sustainable. And so Israel now has to, and the world has to think very, very rapidly about what's going to happen in Gaza the day after. And as it is now, it's the years of rehabilitation already is something that's going to impede life there. And I think it's impossible also for this to end without Israel having some kind of temporary occupation of at least part of the Gaza Strip. It's focused now on the northern part in Gaza City. I think I heard an Israeli official say today that it's not going to relinquish its control over security for quite a while. So that is de facto a reoccupation of the Strip. And that's not something that I think Israel is interested in. And there are many voices on the right in Israel who have talked about resettling Gaza, who have talked about pushing Palestinians out of Gaza into Sinai. These are real ideas that are being floated around. I don't think that they are necessarily going to be implemented by the decision makers. And even if there was an effort to do that, I believe that the international community would not let that happen. However, I don't think anyone really understands what is feasible, and I don't think most players are interested in taking Gaza, upon themselves responsibly. So, there's been a lot of discussion about the PLO and the Palestinian Authority specifically being restored, but that's problematic on many, many levels. Primarily that the PA no longer has legitimacy amongst Palestinians, and it's corrupt, and it's not able to govern the West Bank. So why would it be able to govern Gaza? But I think we have to wait and see what happens. But it's clear that there will have to be some kind of intermittent and temporary effort by people who care about the future of the people in Gaza to coordinate some kind of international, not just humanitarian, but also political and governing authority that is able to provide safety and security to both peoples. But unfortunately, until Israel feels like it's able to move people back to its borders, I don't see how it's going to stop what it's doing right now.
Thank you. I think so. I mean, Prime Minister Netanyahu went into this crisis already weakened by a big civil society movement over the last few months that was focused on the issue of power over the courts. And I'm wondering how that weakened position plays out in negotiating, a ceasefire to this conflict. I mean, we've seen today a call for ceasefire from across the humanitarian system. But even humanitarian pauses and corridors seem to be, off the table in terms of the way that Secretary Blinken has been received over the last 48 hours. So I'm wondering, how that weakened political context plays out and what US influence might or might not be able to do in this context.
I mean, I think that the decision-making process amongst the war cabinet in particular and the Israeli government in general is in disarray. And there's nobody in this country that I think wants to see Netanyahu at the helm right now. And it's hard to overstate just how much the lack of trust and the lack of reliance and dependency on this government is at this point. It was already bad beforehand with the protests all year against this far-right government, but now it is extreme, and there's open calls for Netanyahu to resign. But in the meantime, he's managing a war, and I think regardless of the disarray in the government, which really does impede on making clear decisions, there is a consensus that this is something that they have to do to restore security, restore deterrence, and that any kind of humanitarian aid that goes to Hamas is directly an affront to their efforts to incapacitate Hamas. And, I think that there's plenty of examples in which, it's absolutely true that Hamas would, use fuel or other materials to continue this war. But obviously Israel is making its decisions about these matters, and I think the U.S. has a huge role to play in this, and I think it's trying. It's kind of trying at once to both support Israel in its war, but also to try and create ways to provide humanitarian aid. It's not doing a very good job of it. And I don't see Israel kind of slowing this down unless it feels like it has enough achievements and enough leverage. Specifically regarding the hostages. I think Netanyahu did say he would agree to some kind of ceasefire if all the hostages were released. I don't know. There's a lot of back channel talking. I don't know if it's on the table or not. But fuel, for example, is something that Israel has refused outright. And again, it's, the IDF stance is the fuel is in the tunnels with Hamas. They have, stored fuel there. They could provide it to citizens. They could provide it to hospitals. They're not doing that. So it's not our job to do it. So it's a very, very difficult situation. And I think the US will feel more and more pressured as the civilian casualties mount, that it will have to do something. And I mean, Israel has now allowed, I think, 100 trucks a day to come in through Rafah, and that's, not enough, clearly. And we heard here about the water situation, and I have colleagues in Gaza who are drinking unpotable water. And I mean, I don't know how long this can go on. And in some, perverse way, there's people in Israel and also Americans who are saying, if you want to wage this war, you need to create a humanitarian sustainability, right? You can't do both at once. So it could be that just for that reason, Israel will have to bend to pressure. But I don't think that there's enough pressure at this point. And the siege on Gaza is the worst it's ever been. And so it's a kind of a ticking clock, and I think the time is not on anyone's side right now. And so obviously it's in the interests of all civilians involved that we try to reach some kind of negotiation towards a ceasefire, so that there can at least be those humanitarian corridors that are allowed to move, and then maybe after that we figure out what's next. Unfortunately, that there's talk about that happening, but I don't see it happening anytime soon. So it would be good for the US to put a lot more pressure for that to happen.
Thank you. I had many more questions for you, but I think I'm going to leave it at that and move on to Dr. Dabbagh. But thank you so much for that analysis, Meirav. So Dr. Dabbagh, you work with the International Center of Justice for Palestinians, and I think perhaps not all of our listeners will be familiar with the work of ICJP. So perhaps could you just briefly share what work the center has historically done to advance Palestinian rights using the law, and also how you see the role of international law in this space?
Okay, thank you, Monette, and thank you to all the panelists and for inviting me here. And I just, as a starting point, because it's a difficult time for all of us, I'd just like to, extend my empathy to everyone who has friends and family in the region. I know that a lot of people have lost people and are extremely concerned on both sides. And so just to extend that empathy from the starting point. ICJP, my organization, is fairly new. It was founded in 2021. So it came about really in the wake of the decision by the International Criminal Court to open an investigation into the situation in the occupied Palestinian territories. This was a step taken by the former prosecutor who it was a very brave step taken by her against a lot of political backlash and pressure to not do so, but she did extend the jurisdiction. So at the moment, there is a mandate to investigate crimes committed both by Palestinians and Israelis in that territorial jurisdiction. So some of the work that we initially did with high hopes for the ICC was to submit two what are called Article 15 communications, which anyone can submit. You don't have to be a lawyer, you don't have to be part of an organization, but you can just say to the ICC, look, there's a situation here. We think you should look at it. This is something which we believe is grave enough to be of concern to you. So the two main cases that we started out with, firstly, was with regards to journalists. There seemed to have been a very high number of Palestinian journalists being killed in the West Bank and the Gaza Strip. So working together with the International Federation of Journalists, we submitted quite a detailed complaint setting out the legal argument, which had the cases of 4 journalists, 2 who had been shot in the eye in the West Bank and 2 who had been killed. This was submitted last year, just before the incidents of May the 11th, when Shireen Abu Akleh, the Al Jazeera journalist, was killed in Jenin. So we added the incident of that case to this other communication. Since then, we really haven't had much engagement from the court. It has been quite disappointing. The other case that we have is with regards to the expropriation and destruction of Palestinian property. So those are our 2 main ICC cases. In terms of the body of our work overall as an organization, it's mainly legal, it's international and domestic. And then we also have a political sort of arm, like trying to see how we can affect public policy, and then a sort of media artistic outreach section, but those are much smaller than this main body, which is the legal. And our kind of guiding principles with regards to how we use the law is that we're really pushing for more rules-based accountability, greater equality under the law, both domestically and internationally. And our feeling is that if the law is good enough for Palestinians, it's really good enough for anyone, because at the moment, a lot of the hardest of constrictions with regards to civil liberties in the UK, for example, I know the same is happening in the US, are around the issue of Palestinian rights and lobbying on Palestinian rights internationally. This is sort of the Palestinian space which is being closed down on campuses. And at the moment in the UK, one of the issues we're dealing with is the anti-boycott bill. There's similar provisions in the US. So as a way of like having we have a website, it has basic information about what we're doing. But I think to have a look at the 4 events that we've done, they give an idea as to our focus over the last 2 years. So we started off with the first panel, which had all of the main human rights organizations who were saying that the system of governments in Israel is documenting how the crime against humanity of apartheid is being enacted there and factually backing that. So that's the Palestinian group Al-Haq, the Israeli group B'Tselem, Human Rights Watch, Amnesty International, and we also had the group Dawn, Democracy in the Arab World Now on that panel. So we started with apartheid. We then moved on to looking at boycott and the right to boycott, and talking to South Africans people who had been involved in the South African anti-apartheid movement and looking at the threats to that space in the UK. Following from that, we had a film showing of Tantura, which is an Israeli film. But what we thought was important about it was to show a kind of acceptance of a level of alleged criminality in the way that the state of Israel was formed and where that debate is at, and an awareness of the historic background to Palestinian rights. More recently, last week, we had a panel on the war in Gaza with a mixture of Palestinian, Israeli, and international speakers. So yeah, we're interdisciplinary and we're international. I hope, yeah.
Mm. So clearly, committed to using sort of legal strategies, legal analysis to, advance the cause of Palestine and Palestinian rights. And I'm just wondering, as you look at the current conflict, what sort of issues are you focused on in terms of using some of those legal strategies, to advance this, the fight for justice? And secondly, perhaps a bigger question, the role of the law in advancing that struggle.
Right. So since the events of October 7th and onwards, our main sort of push has been to try to put pressure on the government here to implement a ceasefire. The level of death and the reports of alleged war crimes are quite significant, I would say. We also have been drawing some parallels, not because we're not sympathetic to the situation in Ukraine, but just trying to say, could you put some of the resources, empathy, and legal standards that you put in place when it came to that quite, not altogether similar, but a comparable situation? Could you use a fraction of those when it comes to looking at the situation in Gaza from a civilian perspective, because the level of death has been so extraordinarily high? I think within the first 3 weeks, it pretty much matched 19 months in Ukraine. I think the level of child deaths is also way higher. In the response of the British police in this country has been quite different, whereas with the Ukraine, there were posters put up in the airports asking for people to report on war crimes. There's been the more recent there hasn't really been an open channel for us to report on cases in Palestine in the same way, which is what we are trying to put pressure on them to open up. We had one visit by the prosecutor to the Rafah border, where the commitments were not particularly substantial, I would say, in terms of the ICC. There's also the question of people going off to fight in a region where there is conflict going on, when in Syria, in the Ukraine, and in Afghanistan, there are provisions within the law here where people are questioned upon return. There's a general sort of scrutiny as to whether people may or may not be participating in possible war crimes. So that is another area where we're querying the role of the crime prevention mechanisms in this country. And just the statements being made by politicians are often fairly, from a Palestinian perspective, can seem to be far from balanced and pay scant regard to potential loss of life of civilians. So in that respect, we feel, when there is a lot of a growing debate within the international legal community about whether that we are running a greater risk of coming close to genocide in this situation, as to whether trying to put pressure on politicians to call for a ceasefire to ensure that they are not in a position where they're encouraging such acts to potentially take place. Yeah.
Thank you so much. So I'm conscious of time, and I would like to open up for the whole panel. We've had a lot of questions come in from the audience. Unfortunately, we won't be able to get to all of them, but I would like to get to some of them. And Dr. Dabagh, you just ended there with that discussion about the need for a ceasefire. And one of the questions that came in was, asking panelists to comment on the distinction between ceasefires versus humanitarian pauses, and why the ceasefire is the moral imperative when it comes to addressing the particular health needs of this population. So if I could ask all of our panelists to put themselves back on video, and would invite any of you to take up that question. The ceasefire seems to be the resounding call from the humanitarian community, including the UN today. And it came across very strongly in your presentations as well. And perhaps you could say why that is the moral imperative from a health perspective, if it is, in your opinion. Dr. Kadir, I feel like calling on you first.
Sure, no worries. So a ceasefire ensures that all the violence stops. So when we talk about ceasefire, I mean, this is all sides, right? So what we need to do is we need to make sure that we can have sustained access, and that the people who are accessing, so the humanitarian workers who are accessing, are able to be safe, and that also the patients who are seeking care, who are, whether it's in a facility or in some other kind of structure, and regardless of what kind of humanitarian support there be, whether it's food or water or healthcare or education or psychosocial first aid, water, sanitation. If we have temporary, I mean, you can have these temporary sort of access. There is a history of not respecting that, and there's always a risk, and it still will not allow us to meet the needs. The needs are massive, as we've been describing. The numbers are extraordinary. The scale of the destruction is extraordinary. So to be able to safely and effectively provide care, we need a ceasefire so that we can get to work.
Dr. Gillard, I see your hand went up. Very polite of you.
And I just wanted to clarify some of the confusion that has arisen in the terminology between calls for humanitarian pauses or truces. So shorter term suspensions of hostilities for a very specific humanitarian purpose, in the sense of allowing a particular humanitarian actor to carry out activities at a particular location at a particular time in a manner that is safe because hostilities have been suspended. These are the humanitarian truces, pauses, and so on and so forth that many have been calling from, and they're temporary in nature, not ideal, but a way of allowing goods in, allowing people to go and reach the humanitarian assistance, allowing civilians to go and access medical care. These are different from broader cessations of hostilities across the areas. And those are the ones that many states have been reluctant to call for, because these would have an impact on the capacity to reach the strategic military goals. So I think it's very important for us to distinguish between the two. The reality is that during ongoing active hostilities, it is likely to be the more temporary and very specific types of suspensions of hostilities that will be achieved. And another point that we need to be very clear about is that while the General Assembly states can call for them, it is for parties to agree them and to agree the modalities very clearly. And what we need for that is an intermediary that can help them reach agreement and have clarity on the very specific details of every temporary suspension of hostilities in order to carry out particular humanitarian activities.
Thank you. I think that's very helpful to sort of clarify the terminology. I have to say I was also struck by something that Meirav said in her comments, which was arriving at humanitarian sustainability of the conflict. And it brought to mind many of the concerns that I've been hearing from students and others about the nature of humanitarian work in a space like this. And, you know, the sense that we've been reduced, as one of my colleagues said, to just counting trucks as they go in. And Ella, I wondered if I could call on you to say a little bit more about the nature of humanitarian action in this space, why that work continues to be important, and perhaps why it's not just a Band-Aid while you know, the conflict rages on around it, or perhaps it is. Over to you.
I mean, the purpose of humanitarian aid is to meet the needs of people in conflict. It's not, we're not peacemakers. We're not the people who come up with durable solutions. So by no means would I step into that space. We're an emergency organization. We provide medical care to those most in need in places where other people can't reach. And right now we can't reach Gaza because of the way this war is being conducted. So that's why we have called for a ceasefire. It's a little bit different from how MSF often positions ourselves, but we are calling for a ceasefire because there's no other way for us to provide the medical humanitarian aid that civilians are entitled to under the law, and that we are required by mandate of being a humanitarian organization to provide. So I think when we talk about that moral imperative, that's where we're coming from, that our purpose, our identity, our existence is to provide that essential life-saving aid. And we're not able to do so under the current circumstances. And so that has to change. I mean, counting trucks, we've gotten 4 out of 5 trucks with MSF supplies in so far. It's absolutely not anywhere near what's needed. And we don't have access to all of Gaza either.
Would anyone else like to jump in on that point? There are many other questions that I could move to, but thank you for clarifying that. And clearly, humanitarian advocacy is also incredibly powerful in this space in sort of visibilizing what is happening on the ground. So I think that is also something to bear in mind. You know, one of the other questions that's come through very clearly in the Q&A is around targeting and health facilities and the, you know, the growing sense that allegations are that hospitals and medical facilities are being used to hide and as a shield for the actions of armed groups in Gaza, and therefore, are increasingly being brought into being direct targets. There have been a number of questions that ask us to clarify what the situation would be in those circumstances, and I think everyone has something to say on this. Perhaps I'll start with you, Dr. Gillard, and then maybe we can hear from some of our other colleagues as well.
Thank you. So the law's clear on this. Hospitals are entitled to special protection. They must be respected and protected at all times and not be the object of attack. Under no circumstances can hospitals be used in an attempt to shield military objectives from attack. So that goes to the question of alleged misuse of the hospitals. The special protection to which the hospitals are entitled does not cease unless they are used to commit acts harmful to the enemy. And this is a broad notion. So again, the allegations that there are underground tunnels to store military supplies, fuel for military operations, so for militants to hide and move around, would be an act harmful to the enemy. That would mean that the special protection to which hospitals are entitled would cease. A warning must be given, giving the party that is abusing the special protection of the hospital time to stop these activities. If these warnings remain unheeded, then the special protection ends. Where does that mean? It leaves us in the ordinary rules of IHL that I outlined before, and in particular, the rules relating to proportionality and precautions. We would be in a situation where we have a hospital with a military objective in the vicinity, and we would have to make the determination that I explained before in terms of, is it possible to target the military facilities with only causing limited damage to the hospital? What is the proportionality assessment that needs to be carried out? And I would say that in those circumstances, it would be very difficult. I mean, it would be a very difficult determination to make. Again, we have civilians, we have the wounded and sick, we have the reality of Gaza today, where the healthcare system is under colossal strain. There's no alternatives to seek medical assistance elsewhere. So it would be a very, very difficult to justify from a proportionality perspective.
Thank you. Anything else to add from our other panelists on that point? So one of the other, I think, issues that has come through very clearly in the presentations you all made is the degree of pressure, particularly on local staff that are working in the health and humanitarian system to try and sustain services to people under these extreme conditions. And I just wondered whether our colleagues could speak a little bit more to how does one take care of these most sort of vital elements in your programs in these difficult times. And I think this is probably for SAVE and MSF the most. What kinds of measures are you thinking about putting in place for your humanitarian workers on the ground?
I can start. It's just right now, to be very clear, we don't have the ability to coordinate medical work in Gaza. So I just want to be very, very clear. We can't contact all of our staff. We know people continue to work in hospitals. When we are able to contact staff, they're able to describe what they're seeing. They're able to ask for support. They're constantly asking for medications, for water, for fuel to make the generators go. and to have lights in the operating theater and so on. So we understand from them what the needs are in the hospitals right now. The problem is just not having the access to them. And so what we really need is to move more humanitarian staff in. Staff who are there have been working, they're exhausted, they're emotionally distressed by what they've been experiencing. They haven't been able to sleep properly. And so we have staff saying, look, we're going to make terrible mistakes because we're operating under enormous pressure without the supplies we need. And we haven't been able to sleep properly because there's just constant bombardment. And so it's sort of a difficult one to answer in terms of what we would put in place. We need to have the deconfliction processes respected. We've notified both sides of where our locations are. We need to not have any humanitarian sites or civilian infrastructure targeted so that we can access them and work there safely. And we need a free flow of humanitarian staff and supplies in accordance with the needs of the population, not in accordance with political objectives.
And I think picking up on that question for the whole panel, perhaps to close out this webinar, what more can we all be doing to bring a stop to this conflict and to alleviate this suffering? If there was one thing that you wanted to lift up that a constituency such as ours could be working on, what would it be? So Dr. Kadir, I see you have your hand up, but I'm happy to also extend that to everyone else on the panel. Dr. Kadir.
Yeah, I'll just be very brief. I think the key is to speak up, and because there's a lot of fear about this. There's a lot of fear of consequences that, and also people being uncertain about what's happening. There are news reports, of course, but there's also the UN regularly updates. If you need to find information about figures, we can. I think maybe Dr. Zard can also. I can help you give a link to these. But speaking out, breaking the silence, and I think I would ask if people would just focus on humans, on children, and all children, and valuing all children's lives equally. So, because all children are affected by this and they're harmed by it. So if we come back to our appealing to our humanity, there needs to be political pressure to be able to allow to stop fighting, to put in place a ceasefire and allow unrestricted humanitarian access according to the needs of the population. So silence kills. So that's all.
Thank you. Merav, perhaps I'll go to you next.
Sure. I mean, I guess from where I'm standing, the way I approach it, I would say that there's been a lot of kind of rationalizing of why a ceasefire would not be in the interests of Israel's security. I think we need to keep in mind that a ceasefire is in the interests of everybody's security in the moment that it happens, and that what needs to happen after that is a serious political engagement with what's going to happen, because the issue in Gaza is not just a humanitarian one, it's a political one. And as much as the violence overshadows that, the structural violence that Israel has been engaged in and the violence that Hamas is engaging in needs to stop immediately. And then there's always room for political engagement. So one should not be, pitted against the other.
Thank you. Thank you. Who would like to go next?
I think I would just like to add to I agree very much with Aisha and Mariv in terms of the need for a political solution, a ceasefire, for people to speak up, for people to see this as a real testing point for the way that international human rights law, humanitarian law, and criminal law develops in the future, and how much it is distorted. I find it very disturbing, the number of questions that have come in around hospitals and about hospitals being legitimate targets. And I'm just worried about, I think, be skeptical about the news sources with regards to this, because there are no real safe spaces in Gaza. We've heard this from a number of people, and people are gathering around the hospitals. I have no idea. I have no internal information with regards to Hamas or what's going on, but the attack on the Ahli hospital was then, the initial controversy around that was then dispelled. Even the New York Times said this is the Israeli government allegations with regards to that were then dispelled, but that seems to just be something quite terrifying at the moment, the way that there seems to be a focus now on the Gaza hospitals at such a time of great need and desperation. So yeah, just be skeptical, I think, is my last thing.
You're right. It really does feel as if hospitals are being encircled, and there's sort of a drum roll of planning and threat and counter threat around them. So I hear you. Dr. Gillard, anything to add on that? You've sort of stated the sort of legal positions very clearly. Any last words on
and I'd say
what we can do?
Mustn't forget that there are responsibilities on both sides to this conflict and concerning behavior on both sides. What I would tend to say is that what's most useful now, in my view, are very practical endeavors to find ways to bring humanitarian assistance in, to address allegations of diversion, to find ways of responding to the people in need. And this probably needs more quiet than the noise and the allegations of violations that we're hearing. I realize I'm not making myself popular by saying this, but I would say that that is what is most urgently needed. And I would assume that this is what humanitarian organizations are currently striving to do here, as they do in every conflict.
Thank you. So Ella, I believe that gives you the last word, very briefly.
Also looking at the questions in the chat, and I just want to say that from the humanitarian perspective, attacks on civilians by any party are absolutely unacceptable. And so there should not be any misunderstanding. The focus of this was on Gaza, but it doesn't mean that we don't care about civilians elsewhere. And as a matter of principle, MSF has extended offers of support to all parties for humanitarian assistance, and we will continue to do so in solidarity as humanitarians.
Thank you. Thank you so much. So thank you to all of you. Thank you. There's so much more to discuss. Unfortunately, I don't think this conflict is going to go away anytime soon. But I do have to draw our conversation to a close, and I hope that in the days ahead, humanity prevails. I'd like to thank all of my colleagues who helped put this conversation together, this incredible panel together. And thank you to our audience for your many questions. But most of all, I really would like to thank our amazing panelists for sharing your insight, your passion, and your thoughts on how we can bring some sort of humanity into this terrible situation. So thank you all for the work that you do. Please take care. Bye all.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thanks, Monette.